Our next speaker is Dr. Dmitri Iarikov, the Acting Deputy Director in the Division of Anti-Infective Products, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA is leading a variety of approaches to encourage the development of new antibiotics, and we're so pleased to have him with us today to share some of this work.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. As you know, the decline in antibacterial drug research and development, a serious antibacterial drug-resistant infection increase is a critical public health and patient care concern. And today we're going to talk about FDA approaches to facilitate antibacterial drug development for patients with unmet medical needs. I'm going to describe challenges in developing drugs to address antimicrobial resistance, and then discuss FDA approaches to facilitate antibacterial drug development. One of the reasons for decline in antibacterial drug development is that conducting clinical trials to evaluate antibacterial drugs for the treatment of patients with a serious bacterial disease caused by resistant pathogens is challenging for a number of reasons. First, these trials are difficult to enroll because patients are often critically ill, and delays in treatment related to enrollment procedures may not be acceptable. Then there's a diagnostic uncertainty with regard to the indexed infectious disease and its bacterial etiology. Plus, multiple study sites need to be recruited, as the cases of resistant infections may be spread geographically and occur infrequently. As a result, the interpretation of the results of trials in resistant infections can be challenging. The sample size of trials in patients with these infections are commonly small. Mortality and morbidity related to underlying comorbidities may confound efficacy and safety assessments, and prime potentially active antibacterial therapy may obscure the effect of the antibacterial drug under study. There are also financial disincentives to develop drugs against resistant pathogens. Population in need may be relatively small. Antibacterial drugs are prescribed in general for a short duration. In addition, development of resistance and antimicrobial stewardship efforts may limit the use of the drug. Also, the use of the drug, if approved, may be limited by non-availability of antimicrobial susceptibility testing at the time of approval, because testing devices are developed by companies independent from the drug developer. Given the challenges associated with the development of antibacterial drugs for treatment of serious bacterial diseases, FDA has been implementing several regulatory approaches to accelerate antibacterial drug development, including expedited development programs, qualified infectious disease product designations, streamlined unmet need development programs, and limited population antibacterial and antifungal drugs approval pathway. I'm going to briefly describe these approaches. My apologies for some wordy slide. All four expedited programs represent efforts to address an unmet medical need in the treatment of a serious condition. These programs offer several incentives to drug developers, including more frequent interactions with FDA, and some of the programs offer a short review clock, and notably, a drug may be eligible for more than one expedited program. I have to say that the accelerated approval pathway, which is based on a surrogate endpoint, is not commonly used in the development programs of antibacterial and antifungal drugs, and because clinical outcomes can be readily measured in these conditions. QIDP designation. For a drug product to be designated a QIDP, The drug developer should demonstrate that the drug is an antibacterial, antifungal drug for human use intended to treat serious or life-threatening infections, and the designations offer quite a few incentives. It provides additional 5 years of marketing exclusivity. It grants priority review for the first application for this drug for QIDP, and it makes the drug eligible for fast track designation. And the request can be sent at any time of the development cycle before submission of the marketing application, including a pre-IND stage. Now I'm going to talk about unmet need development programs. As compared to standard development programs, unmet need programs may allow a greater degree of uncertainty in the efficacy and safety of the drug, as they are focused on conditions whose treatment or diagnosis is not addressed adequately by available therapy. An unmet need includes a longer-term need for society, for instance, development of resistance to antibacterial drugs, or a more immediate need for a defined population, for instance, a serious infection with no or limited treatment options. For the drug developed or for the unmet need population, a smaller trials and smaller size of the development program will be considered acceptable. The approval of the drug may be based on the single well-controlled trials supported by evidence from animal and laboratory studies, but risks and benefits will be then communicated in the labeling of the drug. Different approaches can be used to evaluate an antibacterial drug developed for an unmet medical need population, including non-inferiority and superiority clinical trials. These approaches are outlined in the FDA guidance, and the most common approach has been a single non-inferiority trial at a body site of infection, for instance, urinary tract infection, with supported evidence from in vitro and animal models. One of the recently approved beta-lactam/beta-lactamase inhibitor combination, mirapen and ivermectin, was approved based on the results of a single trial in complicated urinary tract infection. Approval of another beta-lactam/beta-lactamase inhibitor combination, ceftazidime and ivermectin, for treatment of intra-abdominal and urinary tract infection was based on the results of 2 phase 2 trials, one for each indication, and also relied on previous findings of the efficacy and safety of ceftazidime, whereas the contribution of beta-lactamase inhibitor ivermectin was primarily established in vitro and in animal models. And these examples are to demonstrate flexibility and openness in thinking of the agency when dealing with such a serious problem as antimicrobial drug resistance. We have learned several lessons since the implementation of unmet need programs. First, the suitability of a drug for these streamlined development programs needs to be considered. In general, candidates for an unmet need program should be drugs that are likely to have a new mechanism of action, or an edit inhibitor that neutralizes a mechanism of resistance, or offers an alteration in the structure that makes the drug no longer susceptible to the mechanism of resistance, or improve its safety. And then I have to say that the drug that has slightly greater potency or offer no significant safety advantages is generally not a good candidate for an unmet need medical program. It has to be said that pharmacokinetics of drugs in the unmet need population may differ from that in less sick patients, and efficacy and safety data collected in less sick patients might not always be extrapolated to a more severely ill unmet medical need population. We also noted that trials in patients with infections due to organisms of a specific resistance phenotype, for instance, carbapenemase resistance, Enterobacteriaceae, are challenging to enroll. And some development programs included a small descriptive study in patients with HIV, and without having no pre-specified analysis, and it made interpretation of study results extremely difficult. In addition, with expedited clinical development programs, chemistry, manufacturing, and control aspects of the program often lag behind, which may delay the approval of the needed drug. Another regulatory approach designed to help accelerate drug development is a limited population pathway for antibacterial and antifungal drugs, also known as the LPAC pathway. The pathway is established by the 21st Century Cure Act, which was signed into law on December 13, 2016. The Act also includes other sections on antimicrobial susceptibility testing and antimicrobial stewardship. And the drugs eligible for the LPAC pathway are intended to treat a serious or life-threatening infections in a limited population of patients with unmet needs. Importantly, statutory standards for drug approval should be met under LPAC, and the labeling of products approved under this pathway will indicate that safety and effectiveness have only been demonstrated in a limited population. In addition to regulatory approaches, FDA has implemented several scientific approaches to facilitate antibacterial drug development, including establishing antimicrobial susceptibility test interpretive criteria and creation of AHT criteria website, facilitation of coordinated development of antimicrobial drugs and AHT devices, publishing guidances on drug development for specific indications. Recently, Office of Antimicrobial Products has initiated research efforts. FDA convened several public meetings on antibacterial drug development, and we're actively collaborating with other regulatory authorities. This is I'm afraid it's quite a busy slide, but this is a screenshot of susceptibility test interpretive criteria website that was launched recently, and from now on, data on susceptibility interpretive criteria would be placed on this website instead of package inserts. These slides will address challenges in providing appropriate susceptibility information for patient care. There have been considerable delays between drug labeling updates and device updates, and in addition, there might be need for interpretive criteria for pathogens not listed in the indication sections of drug labeling. So all these problems resulted in in efforts to accelerate coordinated development of antimicrobial drugs and devices for antimicrobial susceptibility testing. A public workshop was convened, guidance on coordinated development of antimicrobial drugs and antimicrobial susceptibility testing devices has been drafted, and drug office and device office of the FDA have participated in several joint meetings with drug device manufacturers to devise potential developmental approaches. We've published several guidances, and this slide is to illustrate our efforts. It's more for reference. I'm not going to dwell on each guidance, but you might see that over the last couple of years there have been quite a few guidance documents published by the FDA. We launched several research projects. and through broad agency announcements, including development of automated and sustainable electronic approach for data mining to evaluate clinical outcomes of patients with bacterial infections with the focus on drug-resistant infections. We work on evaluation of measurement properties of patient-reported outcome instruments in patients with several infections. And we're trying to bridge novel lab animal and hollow fiber infection models to evaluate central nervous system penetration of drug in infants. We have research contracts for animal models of infections, and research proposals to address antibacterial drug resistance are evaluated on an ongoing basis throughout the fiscal year. And this is a website where our research activities can be sought and studied, and the website provides needed information for those who are interested. This slide provides information on FDA public meetings dedicated to development of drugs targeting resistant infections. And there are quite a few additional efforts that FDA is trying to make to facilitate development of antibacterial drugs. We collaborate with several initiatives and consortiums, and on improvement of trial effectiveness, developing trial endpoints, and also on broad issues related to challenges in antibacterial drug development. And I would like to conclude that FDA recognizes that despite all efforts to accelerate antibacterial drug development, challenges remain, and we're committed to using the tools at our disposal to help encourage the development of safe and effective drugs for serious bacterial and fungal diseases to address unmet needs of patients. And this is the list of recently approved antibacterial drugs over the last 5 years. There have been quite a few drugs approved recently, and some of them target resistant infections. And this concludes my presentation, and thank you.